Hey everyone, welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. In the Mobile User Acquisition Show, we talk about how to use mobile user acquisition strategies to grow your app quickly and capital efficiently. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is presented by me, Shamant Rao, mobile growth leader and founder and CEO of the mobile growth consulting firm Rocketship HQ. Each episode includes strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition that you can use to unlock tremendous growth for your app in a sustainable and capital efficient manner.
Our guest today is David Philippson, the CEO of DataSeat, which offers in-house programmatic capabilities to app advertisers. David earlier founded one of the first MMPs, AdX Tracking, which we sold to Criteo in 2013. As you can imagine, that experience of working with the iTunes App Store since its very early days gives David a very unique perspective on where we are today with IDFA deprecation and how privacy and device identification has evolved over the years.
I'm very excited to welcome David Philippson to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. David, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. David, we're going to talk about how we ended up here in this time when we are confronting IDFA deprecation in a few months. And, the working title I had for this episode has been A Brief History of Device Identification. And I think one of the things you said was there couldn't be anybody better than me to talk about a brief history of device identification, because you've certainly seen how this has played out for the last decade. So, I'm excited to talk to you and, dive into really how things were like close to a decade ago and how things have evolved since then and how we really got here. To start off, to start off, in the early years of the iTunes App Store, how did marketers measure and attribute performance?
Sure, but one of the downsides of this is that I'm going to show how old I am, because or how long I've been doing mobile advertising, because you've really got to go back. When did this start? If you think the first iPhone shipped in 2009. It then took a while for app developers, to start being able to see this as a challenge. So it's really 2011 that we then started first seeing the need. There was marketing dollars going behind apps, and as soon as there's marketing dollars, you need accountability, which is attribution. So it was around 2011 that we first started seeing the need for this. At the time, before MMPs had even started, before we even started, our MMP. The alternative to app marketeers would be to work with multiple ad network SDKs. And again, showing how long we've been doing this, back then it was, those familiar, it would have been AdMob. Quattro Wireless ended up selling to Apple. InMobi, Millennial, those were the common names for user acquisition channels back then. And the alternative would be that actually app developers got to implement multiple ad network SDKs. And now what happens that there was significant overhead, for implementing multiple SDKs. And of course, that means that all ad networks were counting their own homework in a similar way to SRNs today, I might add. But, you certainly don't want all ad networks counting their own homework. And of course, there was then these huge deduplication issues, i.e., ad networks, counting their own homework or marking their own homework and charging double. So that was what was happening in 2011. Multiple SDKs, and then client and the advertiser were actually paying often twice, two people for driving the same install. And that is the dynamic that actually then led to the rise of the MMPs. Arguably, AdX Tracking was the first, or one of the first, but at a similar time. Our now friends in AppsFlyer had started around the same time. If you remember mobile app tracking, which became Tune, it's starting around the same time, and of course Kashava. But we were all addressing the same problem at the time, which was the need for a universal SDK and a common methodology to attribute and dedupe. And that headline actually still remains part of the value proposition to the MMPs, today. But the world was very different then, and attribution was actually far less accurate then. There wasn't much deterministic attribution. We'll talk about you did in a minute, but when we do, I'll explain why it wasn't used that widely. So early on, we started researching fingerprinting. It still is a standard today, fortunately, unfortunately, depends on your perspective. But so probabilistic fingerprinting was matching the device type, operating system type, and IP address on a click. You then see it on a download, and if it matches, you said that's where it came from. Now, largely it works, but there's lots of false negatives and false positives. So it was probabilistic, and then some of you that have been in the game long enough may also remember when an iPhone app used to launch, a Safari browser may have opened. We used to call that the Safari pop. That actually was a way that we invented terrible user experience, and I'm glad it's not a standard today. Apps launching Safari browsers, but that was the first deterministic method to track, because it would allow us to place a cookie on click. When the app launched, you launch the browser to check the cookie. But that was the start of the first part of deterministic tracking. But there's similar themes today, but the world has changed.
Sure.
That's what it was like at the beginning.
Sure. You briefly mentioned the UDID, or you did. What was that? What shift? What was the ecosystem like when the UDID was present?
So the UDID, it was a unique device identifier. I mean, actually the acronym definition itself is a good description of what it was. It was a persistent ID per iPhone, or per iPad, per iOS device. Because it was persistent, it could be used for attribution. Now, what wasn't happening in the early days, ad networks didn't always have access to it, so they weren't always passing on the click. But that begun to happen in 2012, 2013. It became more common that ad networks that had their own ad server, an affiliate network wouldn't, some of that kind of affiliate type buyers don't always have access to the to the UDID back then. But anyway, so when ad serving became more common, ad networks were able to pass a UDID on click, and that was again another part of the deterministic attribution methods. The problem with it, and it's a completely valid problem, was that it wasn't resettable. So it was a persistent identifier that a consumer couldn't say, I don't want you to do this, or I don't want you to use this to track me across different apps. So it did then it was then removed by Apple, and there was then this bit of no man's land period because it wasn't UDID was gone and IDFA was introduced. There was a long period. I think it was like 6 to 12 month period of when there wasn't this persistent identifier replacement, and there was discussions with the industry as a topic which was open UDID. It didn't get but again, that was one of the initiatives. And
did the IDFA get introduced as a result of pressure by developers, or what happened?
I believe so. Apple is a so despite personal relationships you might have with employees, it's getting official lines or answers from Apple it isn't very common. So I can't say definitively it was because of that. But again, going back to the definition, ID for advertisers, again, so it makes sense that Apple was respecting the need for advertisers to create content, to create valuable content for iPhone users. Advertisers would have been articulating the need for this persistent, privacy-friendly identifier. So it certainly appears that was a result of Apple empathizing with advertisers.
And you did speak about the 6-month period that was a no man's land, where there was no identifier. What did advertisers do during that time to measure and attribute?
it actually created opportunities for MMPs, because in the early days of MMPs, the competition was less between AdX and AxFlyer and Kachava. The competition was actually advertisers doing it themselves. So that was actually a very common theme: in-house attribution. So with UDID, actually you could understand why a gaming developer or an advertiser could actually try and do some of the matching themselves. So actually the no man's land with no UDID, it then needed a partner that had some expertise around probabilistic matching, around the whole cookie tracking, which I acknowledge wasn't great. But actually that period of uncertainty actually created more demand for the MMPs back then, because when there's uncertainty, you go to subject matter experts.
So from my understanding, you did say UDID was a permanent identifier and IDFA was resettable. I remember from my memories of 2012, 2013, I don't think a lot of consumers would go in and reset it. So would it be fair to say that IDFA was resettable, but nobody reset it, and therefore it was more or less like the UDID? Or is that incorrect as a characterization?
I think you're right, but your sample set of the two people that you're asking is a very narrow sample set. If I go to the average, look at the million iPhone users, my mother is one of them. What percentage of them know how to reset or put limited ad tracking in place? It was very few. So I think that it remains a dynamic with IDFA, is that few people knew how to reset it, and that also was the same with limited ad tracking. Few people obviously or intuitively knew how to opt out with limited ad tracking.
Yeah, which brings me to my next question, which is about limit ad tracking. Even though it's been much more in the news lately in the last couple of years, it's very old. And my understanding is it's as old as 2012. So can you tell me about what limit ad tracking looked like in its relatively early days? How did it function back then?
You're testing my granular memory of iOS 6 back in 2012. So if I may, I'll speak more kind of high level on it. I think it's completely reasonable for Apple to have introduced limited ad tracking, whether it was 6 years ago or 3 years ago, and it gives the intent was to give the consumer the right and the option to say, I don't want to be tracked, for the purpose of advertising. And so I completely agree with the principle, and the kind of the interesting thing that I know is now widespread within the industry, but it kind of remained a bit of a hush-hush at the time, is that advertisers, or smart advertisers in the beginning, as limited ad tracking percentage increased. But by the way, we see it's around 16%, different in different countries, but 16 to 18% is common in programmatic. It's a very good sample set. You see billions of ad requests. You can just see what percentage of limited ad tracking in iOS, about 16 to 18. It's about 16 to 18%. But then what we saw advertisers beginning to do was target limited ad tracking users aggressively, specifically. Now, if you think about why, and that was, I go back to the sample set of the two people. Where we would have, I've messed around with my limited ad tracking. I don't. I'm an advertising professional. I'd rather keep mine on. I'd rather everyone kept it on. But limited ad tracking, as a social demographic group, are tech savvy, high net worth individuals.
Yeah.
So when you consider that, so actually the mechanic of how to set limited ad tracking on meant that someone had to be familiar with their iPhone, familiar with the settings, actually have the persistence to go and actually look and do it. By definition of your million iPhone users, they're probably tech savvy, and tech savvy are probably high net worth individuals. If you're an advertiser, that is a good demographic to target. So ironically and almost amusingly, perhaps unfortunately, because it may have led to some of the deprecation we're facing today, limited ad tracking actually backfired because actually those users were targeted even more.
Yeah.
And some of the, and actually limited ad tracking users were still tracked with fingerprinting. It's these dynamics that I believe have some of these dynamics have led to Apple's, most recent policy change, so that, do not track really should mean do not track, not target them even more and then track them with fingerprinting, which is what limited ad tracking became.
Yeah. And were they targeted even more aggressively just because the limit ad tracking was a FYI feature? Like advertisers, FYI, this person has turned it off, but we take no action if you target that. Is that why this dynamic ensued?
The reason it grew was because people experimented with a hypothesis. The hypothesis was someone that said it probably earns more money, so we'll probably buy more of my coins or buy more of my e-commerce transactions, whatever. The hypothesis was tested. They were targeted. They were still able to use fingerprinting, to calculate downloads and to analyze, performance. And the performance was great. As soon as a marketeer sees good performance, that's where the budgets go, and obviously word soon spread. And even today in programmatic, many advertisers will have specific line items or campaigns which are limited ad tracking campaigns, but that will change.
Yeah. And interesting. Just to jump onto something you just said, in programmatic, there are line items of limit ad tracking. Do you think they could still continue to be targeted in a non-targeted way? Is that
so with iOS 14, what changes? I'm expecting, obviously a far larger percentage of people will be opted out, will be limited ad tracking users. So as soon as far more, going back to the million users, one of which is my mother, which will probably opt out, so that group is far larger. It can no longer be considered tech savvy, high net worth targeting, because it's very easy to then opt out.
Right.
If it's very easy to opt out, far more people opt out. Therefore, that social demographic targeting is no longer valid. But within the bid stream, if for any programmatic player, in the bid stream you see a device ID, or you can see a hashed out device ID, which is a limited ad tracking device ID. So if you saw a device ID that was 000, that is a lapped device, and certain campaign types, certain advertisers would target those specifically for that reason. But if everyone opts out, then everyone's in that group. It no longer becomes effective.
Yeah. That's a good observation. So LAT users, well, the LAT category is just going to become less valuable. It's everybody.
It becomes everyone, including my non-tech savvy, relatives. So that don't even know what coins are and can't even, download that properly. So
and as we've talked about just now, there's been a gradual progression from UDID to IDFA to LAT actually being enforced. And of course, now the upcoming IDFA deprecation, there's been a gradual progression over very many years. How does this compare with how privacy policy has changed and evolved on the web?
Yeah, it's a good question and worth drawing comparisons. And I had specific experience. Because although my experience, my kind of expertise is all around app and attribution and programmatic for app, we sold ad tracking to a business called Criteo, that were well known for desktop retargeting at the time. Now, when you look at the impact of ITP, which was intelligent tracking prevention, from Safari, then became ITP2, and then you saw Chrome following suit. Where that had most impact, it wasn't on prospecting. It had impacts on behavioral targeting, which isn't prospecting. Prospecting is more, just trying to find new users. You don't know anything about them. It's more contextual. So ITP, intelligent tracking prevention, and what happened in Chrome, and just the general cookie, kind of controls that have been put in place over recent years. The most negative effects on ad tech players and advertisers was around behavioral targeting and retargeting. Okay, so the impact wasn't actually huge. Of course, it was a significant change, but the impact wasn't huge. It was significant to any retargeting web player because they were restricted considerably. But so the changes that are now happening in iOS with iOS 14, they're similar to the changes from ITP. The objective is similar. However, my observation is that the impact, whilst I said the impact on web wasn't huge, but it did affect behavioral targeting and retargeting. The effect of iOS 14 on app is enormous. It's significant, it's huge, it's affecting nearly everyone. Why? Because nearly all user acquisition, nearly all campaigns are a form of retargeting. So this is the difference between what was a more web-based world and actually what app is. I don't want to call it a cowboy-based world, but what our industry has grown up doing is taking device IDs from all advertisers, putting them into a device graph and bidding on what you know about the device. So even UA prospecting in-app is a form of retargeting. You're targeting someone because you know something about them. So any of the, whether it's cookies or iOS IDFAs, the negative effect is on behavioral is on behavioral advertising. Now, the difference with app is nearly all marketing dollars are going to a form of behavioral targeting, whilst that wasn't the case on desktop. So I'm expecting and predicting that the impact of iOS 14 is far greater on ad tech players in app than ITP was in desktop.
Right. I like that characterization that all of UA is, in a sense, in targeting, because
it's one huge retargeting campaign. And when I speak to some desktop professionals, ad tech professionals that aren't familiar with app, they look at me with shock and say, "What? Everyone's sharing everyone's data?" And I go, "Well, yes." Some people put their head in the sand and pretend it hasn't happened. Some people say, "Yeah, we know it happens. We're addicted to the performance and the ROAS is great." Other people say this isn't sustainable. It's got huge cannibalization effect. Apple will probably want to stop it, and it's probably non-compliant. And that's the route it's gone.
Yeah. And with that context, it's understandable why Apple is doing what it is doing. And certainly, it also sounds to me like there is precedent on the web for operating without that kind of deterministic targeting. There are very many web-based businesses that operate at fairly large scale without requiring that sort of exact, precise knowledge of individual users' behavior. So, would you say that that is the way the world will look potentially in a few months post IDFA deprecation?
So I think that is what the new world will look like. I think the change will be a bit like the S&P or the FTSE. With the pandemic, it will drop off the cliff because iOS 14, this opt-out is gonna happen. And I think the transition will be gradual. So I think there's going to be lots of chaos, lots of, it's going to be hard to measure ROAS and retention. It's going to be hard. Everyone's scrambling to get SK ad network kind of solutions in place. But I think the new normal, if you consider there's two types of bidding, there's behavioral and there's contextual. Behavioral bidding, behavioral bidding will stop. What you know about the device is going to be stopped. Your primary key, the device ID, is gone. So you can't build a record of what you know about the device. So what are you left with? You're left with contextual. And in fact, that is what prospecting UA in the desktop world always has been. There's never been this huge cross-pollination of data. So yes, that will be the new normal. But it's also important that I define what I mean by contextual. And what I mean by contextual is that one advertiser's data, performance data, will only ever be used for that advertiser to optimize performance. So then you've got to go, well, how do you optimize performance? You have to go through a phase of training machine learning algorithms to predict outcome. That's the objective of any machine learning algorithm is predict an outcome. Where the outcome will be, is there going to be an install? So what you actually have to do to train a machine learning algorithm on contextual, you need to run budget over many, many publishers 24/7. And what you're looking to do is to identify patterns. Am I getting my installs, from certain publishers at certain times of the day, at certain times of the, certain hours of the day, certain days of the week? Are they on Wi-Fi? All these many, many variables within the bid stream. When you start seeing conversions, you'll then start being able to predict what variables lead to my conversions. And that is contextual targeting. That is the future of app advertising. And the whole behavioral model, what you know about the device is, is limited. Of course, there are exceptions and outliers to all of the statements I make. I completely accept that. Someone could say, well, I can still do, targeting on Facebook Canvas. I completely agree. There are exceptions. I'm more talking general principles.
Yeah. Do you think this is going to impact the smaller advertisers more than the bigger ones because they have fewer dollars to sink into exploring and learning and whatnot?
I think the ones it affects the most are the ones that are most reliant on paid installs. You can see there's if you look at all advertisers, actually understanding the ratio of their install base and their whole monetization mechanic, how many come from paid versus organic. If you were 90% paid, the short-term kind of transition period where there's lots of uncertainty, lots of stuff's going to get broken and Apple has no urgency to fix it all for us in the short term. Apple don't really care about us ad tech folks. So correctly, I think. But so I think those that will feel the impact the most are the ones that the majority of their users come from paid channels, and then a multiplier effect on those that get affected the most are ones that monetize the most through advertising. So a potential challenging sector will be hyper casual, where they get the majority of their downloads from very specific targeted advertising, and then they monetize the majority of their inventory through behavioral demand. If behavioral demand is how they monetize, that drops off the cliff. The ECPMs will drop, and the ability to acquire new users. Again, there are exceptions to all of my statements. I completely acknowledge, but it will have a variety of effects. I have one customer, that 90% organic. They're one of the known gaming companies, and they're a bit more relaxed about this. I have another customer that's the complete opposite, and they're like, David, what should we be doing? But I think that's the spectrum. Is paid versus organic and monetization via advertising.
Yeah, we are indeed headed into what could be a perfect storm. David, I think all of this helps us contextualize why we are getting into what we are getting into, because this has been more than a decade in the making. Thank you for sharing all of that perspective. I think it also helps inform us about what the future could look like and how we could adapt. This has been incredibly instructive. Perhaps this is a good place for us to wrap. Before we do that, could you tell folks how they can find out more about you and everything you do?
Sure, absolutely. You gave me a kind introduction earlier, but I'm David. I'm the co-founder and CEO of DataSeat. I founded and run DataSeat, which is an in-house programmatic DSP for app developers. I actually see this as an opportunity, these changes as an opportunity for in-house. Because if you think about in-house, if an advertiser was going to in-house their programmatic UA, that would never be behavioral retargeting. That's never based on a device graph, which is why in-house UA always struggle to compete against the status quo that were behavioral bidding. So actually a world that's moving towards contextual, I believe, is in favor of in-housing, which is why one of the reasons we thought this was going to happen, which is why we decided to focus on that opportunity. But if anyone would like to speak with me, please find me on LinkedIn. Our website is dataseat.com. We'd love to speak to people that are interested in the future of in-housing, and particularly contextual bidding algorithms.
Totally. We're going to link to your LinkedIn and dataseat.com in the show notes. And of course, we'll have a transcript and notes for everybody to reference. For now, David, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for being on the Mobile User Acquisition Show.
Thanks for inviting me. I've enjoyed it. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. If any of this was helpful or instructive, I would love for you to leave us a review or rating on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcast fix. This podcast takes a ton of time, effort, and love to produce, and I deeply value every review and every piece of feedback that you share. Thank you for listening, and I will look forward to sharing our next episode soon.